Good evening, welcome, boa noite. My name is Omar Adawahare, and I'm the Assistant Director at the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies at NYU. On behalf of our director, Jill Lane, our faculty and students, we want to welcome you, our audience, and our distinguished guests, Luisa, Dalmata, Machado, Fernandez, Michael Fox, James Green, and Maria Luisa Mendoza. To what promises to be an insightful conversation on democracy activism in Brazil in the Bolsonaro era. I want to thank our co-sponsors, NACLA and Defend Democracy in Brazil, for organizing this panel. We're also live streaming through the CLACS Facebook page at clacs.nyu. Please take a minute to visit and share this streaming feed with your networks so that we can amplify this conversation. Make sure to follow us to learn more about future events. Now I'm turning the virtual podium to Heather Gies, who's managing editor of NACLA, who's going to say a few words. Obrigado.
Thanks so much, Omar. I also want to start by thanking everyone for joining us, and thanks also to our co-sponsors, CLACS and Defend Democracy in Brazil, and of course to our speakers who are sharing their time and insights with us today. Like Omar said, I'm managing editor of the NACLA report. My name is Heather Gies. For anyone who's new to NACLA, NACLA, or the North American Congress on Latin America, is a nonprofit that began publishing anti-imperialist news and analysis on Latin America and the Caribbean in 1967, following the US invasion of the Dominican Republic. And for more than 50 years, NACLA has remained a leading source of information on the region and on US-Latin America relations. So if you don't already, you can follow our coverage on our website, nacla.org, as well as in our quarterly print magazine, where we take a deep dive into issues in the region. And just to give you a little teaser about what you can expect to see in the magazine in the next months, our next edition is a special country-specific issue on Haiti, offering timely and urgent analysis of what's happening in the country. Then our summer issue will tackle questions of historical memory and historical reckonings across the Americas. So you can find more information about subscriptions on our website, and we do have a student rate subscription, so I encourage you to check that out. I also quickly want to shout out our next event, which is coming up on February 4th. It's titled Ecosocialismo, Envisioning Latin America's Green New Deal. And the event will feature amazing thinkers and activists following up on an issue of our magazine last year that was focused on the idea of a Green New Deal in the Americas. So we're really excited about that event as well, and you can find more details on our website. And finally, I just want to say that if you support NACLA's work, including the reporting that we're bringing you online or in print or through these events that we're so pleased to be able to offer in this virtual format during the pandemic, please consider supporting our work with a donation, which you can do at our website, nacla.org/donate. And with that, I want to hand things over to Natalie de Campos from Defend Democracy in Brazil, who we're very excited to partner with for this event, to talk a little bit more about our event tonight and introduce our first speakers. Thank you.
Thank you, Heather. Thank you, Omar and NACLA, and for first inviting us to do this event and to think about what we wanted to do together. And then for Omar to supporting us and to being the co-sponsor. We are very fortunate to have, partners at NYU and in other organizations as well outside in the US Network for Democracy in Brazil. But I want to talk to you a little bit first about the Defend Democracy in Brazil Committee, which was formed in 2016 in New York by Brazilians mostly, but not only, supporters of democracy in Brazil in light of the approaching at the time impeachment of Dilma Rousseff on flimsy charges that we know were later deemed illegal with no really crime of responsibility basis. And so since then we've done a lot of events like this one, but also especially in person before the pandemic. We've done a number of manifestos and art events and political education events. And I think it's very important for us to have this role in undoing the wrong narratives in the media that have come out. And that's been a large focus of Defend Democracy in Brazil. A lot changed when Bolsonaro got elected, and that means that we turned our attention more to the social movements in Brazil that needed our support, and it still do. And so the solidarity movement became much stronger within the Defend Democracy in Brazil committee and its network. And with that in mind, and Professor James Green, a number of activists and academics, we helped found the US Network for Democracy in Brazil, of which he's going to speak more about. He's the co-coordinator currently, and along with Gladys Waltour. And so with that, with Bolsonaro's election, our shift of focus was very much with solidarity with movements like the MST, the Landless Workers Movement in Brazil, the Black Coalition for Rights that was formed after Bolsonaro got elected, the articulation of indigenous peoples in Brazil, to mention a few, right, of the many movements, and also events and voices of artists and filmmakers who have come to New York to show their work on the resistance. And so we decided to focus, along with Heather and Omar and David from NACLA, we decided to focus on the resistance to Bolsonaro's first 2 years. And I think it's very important for us to remember that it has been great, although, it is a very hard movement of resistance. And at this moment, seeing what's happening in the United States, it is even more important to ramp up, right, the resistance to anti-democratic forces in Brazil and not wait until Bolsonaro's run for re-election or other competing forces like his running for election. We also decided to dedicate this event to two people in particular that we lost in the last year. In particular, Michael Brooks, a huge defender of democracy in Brazil, a journalist who ran his own show, the Michael Brooks Show, and also was part of the Majority Report, who we lost suddenly in July, and with whom we did an event in last February, which was our first partnership with NACLA in February, just before the pandemic hit in New York City. And we also would like to dedicate this event to Diogo Santana, who was one of the first members of Defend Democracy in Brazil. He was also part of the cabinet of Dilma Rousseff and Lula in the Workers' Party governments. And he passed away very suddenly on the 31st of December, closing a very hard year for all of us. So again, we would like to dedicate to both of these defenders of democracy. And with this, I yield the floor to James Green. And then I will briefly mention, Professor James Green is the Carlos Manuel de Céspedes Chair of Latin American History at Brown University. He is the co-coordinator of the US Network for Democracy in Brazil, and also was a former executive director of BRASA, or president of BRASA, the Brazilian Studies Association. He has published a number of books on Brazil, and he's been a huge ally from the beginning of Defend Democracy in Brazil Committee and to many other social movements in Brazil since the 1970s. So, Professor James Green.
Thank you, Natalia. I've been asked to chair tonight's event, and so I'm going to briefly speak about an overview of the US solidarity movement with Brazil and some observations about the dialogue that's going on between Brazil and the United States. And then I'll be introducing in one by one our other panelists who will be speaking for about 7 minutes each. We'll then have an opportunity for a give and take among the panelists. And then at the end of our last speaker, we'll be asking people to post questions that they might have. So if you have questions, save them till the end, and then you can share them on the chat so that we can, towards the end of our event tonight, be able to answer the questions you might have. It's a real honor to be collaborating both with Defend Democracy in Brazil, which is perhaps the most dynamic and most important of all the 35 or so solidarity groups that exist in the United States, collectives, the most dynamic, the one that has really led the rest of the movement nationally in support of Brazil since 2016, when we fought against the coup of Dilma Rousseff, and also to be at NACLA, because as a young activist, having lived in Brazil in the 70s, I came back for a visit to the United States to get a renewal of my visa, and NACLA asked me to write an article about Brazil. I was extremely honored to do that. It was my first published article, And I'm really happy to be able to collaborate again with NACLA. This is a wonderful institution that needs to be supported in any way possible. The U.S. Network for Democracy in Brazil was founded on December 1st in 2018 at Columbia Law School, but its founding was the result of 2 years of previous work, as outlined by Natalia, by collectives, groups, clusters, academics, activists, Brazilians, people who are friends of Brazil throughout the United States. And after the election, we had been working first against the coup, against Dilma Rousseff, against Sergio Moro's campaign, against Lula, his imprisonment, the government of Michel Temer, the electoral campaign, supporting the Ele Não movement, responding to the death of Marielle Franco. And then when Bolsonaro was elected, it really gelled nationally the necessity for people to come together. So 200 activists from all over the country flew to New York to meet for a day to found the US Network, which is a coalition of individuals and groups, activists and academics, independent scholars and artists and others who have 3 points in common. The first is it's a nonpartisan organization, so it's not affiliated to any political party. Its main goal is to defend and support the social movements and unions and other activities in Brazil for progressive change, and to defend the progressive changes that have taken place in Brazil over the last 40 years in the process of democratization. And being a decentralized network, we've had a challenge to find a way to function democratically and nationally. We have a structure that has a steering committee that meets once a month of affiliates of all of our groups. We have currently about 35 groups that are affiliated with the network, representing people in 1,200 people in 45 states and at least 200 universities across the United States. We even have supporters in Idaho, just to give an example. And throughout the last 2 years, our activities have been either to support focused events and mobilizations, such as the ones that Defend Democracy in Brazil did against Bolsonaro when he was awarded the Man of the Year by the Câmara de Comércio, the Brazilian US Chamber of Commerce, and Defend Democracy in Brazil and other groups in New York coalesced to really organize opposition to his receiving that award. And in fact, he cowardly got the award in Texas, to organizing on the anniversary of the death of the assassination of Marielle Franco. Over 55 events were organized across the country to honor her and to talk about systemic racism in Brazil. And the number of events that we've organized nationwide in a decentralized way by the initiative of local groups is too much to enumerate today, but it reflects the kind of the energy, the creativity, and the individuality of every city or region, and the needs, whether it's working with Brazilian immigrants and trying to politicize and accompany the Brazilian community, or working with specialists and activists on Brazil, other people who are interested in Brazil. And I think at our national meeting, one of the things that we presented as a possibility, and I think is one of the most successful things we've done in the last year and a half, was to establish an office in Washington, D.C. About 10 years ago, I wrote a book called We Cannot Remain Silent, Opposition to the Brazilian Military Dictatorship in the United States. And it was a book that traced the origins of solidarity with Brazil in the United States and the campaigns against human rights violations, torture, and other issues in the early 70s. And so there's been solidarity with Brazil in the United States for 50 years. This is actually our 51st year of our 52nd year of documented activities by people supporting progressive movements in Brazil. But what is noted is that throughout this time, there's never been a consistent and systematic activity in Washington, D.C., in the nation's capital, in Congress. There have been always groups in Washington, D.C. doing different kinds of advocacy work, working with human rights groups, working with environmental groups, working with groups fighting for the social justice of rubber tappers, etc. But there has never been a concerted, systematic activity in Congress to try to change the policies of the Trump government in the first moment, and now having influence on the incoming Biden administration. So we did a very bold thing, is to raise $100,000 to manage to open an office with an executive director. And over the course of the last year and a half, but building on work that had been done previously in Washington, D.C., we've managed to have very significant intervention in Congress with progressive Congress people on specific issues. And I'll just give 3 or 4 quick examples among many. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the impact that that might have on Brazil. We organized, along with our partnership with Amazon Watch and Greenpeace and others, the visit of 3 Brazilian congresswomen to Washington, D.C. In February, just before the pandemic hit. And they had the opportunity to meet with 9 congresspeople, including Deb Haaland, who is going to be the newly appointed Minister of the Secretary of the Interior. Very concerned about the situation of indigenous people, very concerned about the state of the Amazon. And so that partnership opened her eyes more profoundly to the situation in Brazil and a willingness to support us. But through this period, we've been able to circulate and get support along with our allies in 9 letters that have circulated in Congress on specific issues related to the environment, to the displacement of the quilombolas, the Afro-descended communities in Alcântara, in Maranhão in the north, on areas near a space station, which the United States has a contract with. We've worked on the defending of Black people and Black lives in Brazil over the recent assassination of a person in southern Brazil, and thinking of other ways in which we can mobilize congressional members to state publicly their opposition to policies in Brazil. And our goal in this regard is to try to get the United States government, or at least get support within the Congress for a progressive agenda vis-a-vis Brazil. We've been very successful in getting that work out in Brazil and getting it to the media. So the major media, Folha de São Paulo, Estadão, and other press have covered our events and our activities, our signature campaigns, our statements, our public records. And this has been having an echo in Brazil. And because precisely the Trump administration supported Bolsonaro, and Bolsonaro built part of his reputation on his closeness to the Trump administration, I think we can say that the elections in 2020 and the victory of Biden is going to weaken the kind of collaboration that exists between the 2 countries. The close collaboration between Bolsonaro, who was willing to make a series of deals with the United States in order to enamor himself to the Trump administration with new trade policies and new trade agreements, including this is kind of a silly thing, but including lifting the requirement of American US citizens to pay the $140 fee to get a visa to go to Brazil, whereas Brazilians still have to pay $140 to get a visa to come to the United States. It was one of the examples in which Bolsonaro was willing to kind of concede to US demands without getting anything, or try to appease to the United States without getting anything in return. My impression, because of the close contacts I have as an individual with vast network of friends in Brazil, is that there's tremendous optimism now, first with the victory of Biden, even though most progressive forces in Brazil have no illusions about the nature of a US government's policies towards Latin America, towards Brazil. And people are aware of the history of US involvement in interfering in Brazilian politics. And many people are concerned about the possible ways in which the US Department of Justice may have been involved in the Lava Jato car wash investigations. But still, the possibility that changing the relationship between Brazil and the United States could have an impact on the politics in Brazil. And I think this is especially true because Bolsonaro is very good at copying and following what he perceives as the talent and the strengths of Trump. And so the defeat of Trump in the United States, I think, portends to the possibility of a defeat of Bolsonaro in the next 2 years. And this raises a series of very complicated questions, as it did in the United States for progressive people who are interested in intervening in the US elections and deciding who they should support, what should be done. It raises serious questions for the electoral strategy for progressive forces in Brazil in 2022 about how to successfully defeat Bolsonaro and kind of advance the democratic and progressive agenda in Brazil. I think even today's victory in impeaching Trump for the second time is a warning, just as Brazilians seeing the invasion of the capital last week was very reminiscent of the threats that Bolsonaro had given to the Supreme Court about the possibility of intervening in the Supreme Court or carrying out illegal activities, another kind of coup. And I think in this regard, to kind of close up, I wanted just to make a comment of my own experiences about working with the US media or working with people in the United States and educating them about Brazil. What is striking to me about what's been happening in the United States, especially since the coup of last week, was that the language being used in Brazil about the coup in 2016 was seen by many people as an exaggeration. It was a hyperbole that wasn't exactly accurate. It was actually somehow a fair democratic impeachment process, although those of us who have been following Brazil closely know how that wasn't the case. But how there's been a shift in the United States, just as in when Bolsonaro was elected in 2018, people started calling him the Trump of the tropics. And we could draw analogies between what Trump is doing in the United States and what Bolsonaro is doing in Brazil, including issues around environmental protection and destruction of workers' rights and favoring the wealthy as opposed to the working class, denying COVID, doing nothing to really respond to the pandemic, which will be talked about by other panelists. But also the understanding that the United States is vulnerable to authoritarian regimes and the possibilities of coups as Brazil was in 2016. And I think this is helpful for us as we try to explain to people in the United States the complexities of Brazilian reality and go beyond the stereotypes and the simplistic understanding that most people have about Brazil in this country. So if any of you are listening, whether you're from Brazil or in the United States and want to get involved with the US Network for Democracy in Brazil, the simplest way is to send an email to democracybrazil, one word, Z for Brazil, @gmail.com. And we'll be glad to put you on our mailing list to receive information about our work and get you involved in our activities. So I think I didn't look at my watch to see if I was actually doing a 7-minute. I hope my mental clock was close to the 7-minute limit. But now I'm going to pass the word on to Maria Luisa Mendoza, who is a human geographer from the University of São Paulo and a research scholar at the Center for Peace, Culture, and Politics at CUNY Graduate Center in New York. Maria Luisa is the co-director of the Rede Social de Justiça e Direitos Humanos, the Network for Social Justice and Human Rights in Brazil, and the editor of the book Human Rights in Brazil, published annually since 2000. Her research includes history and political economy of agriculture, food, land, and water systems, and geopolitical processes of resistance by rural social movements in Brazil and internationally. And she is the author of Economia Política de Agronegócios, The Political Economy of Agribusiness, by Ana Bluma at São Paulo in 2018. And so Maria Luisa, please join us for 8 minutes or so of your contributions.
Thank you very much. Very happy to be here. Thank you for the organizers. It's a wonderful event, DDB, Natalie, and NYU. And I'm going to speak about the land and natural resources and the geopolitical disputes around that, and Brazil, of course, being a center, a target for land speculation and destruction. We all have seen the huge fires in the Amazon, also in the Brazilian Cerrado, which is the most the largest savanna in the world and the most biodiverse savanna in the world, and also in the Pantanal, the destruction of the huge wetland area in Brazil. And of course that we know that the level of destruction that we have seen recently is a direct result of policies of the Bolsonaro government and also of his rhetoric. Encouraging destruction, encouraging land grabbing, mining, in very sensitive areas of Brazil. And also we have seen his attacks on rural communities in Brazil, peasant communities, indigenous and quilombola communities, which are the rural Afro-Brazilian communities that are really in the forefront of this struggle, of these geopolitical struggles over land and natural resources. So it's very important to build solidarity here in the US in support of those communities. And one of the main tendencies that we identified years ago, together with my colleagues in my organization, we started to look at a new tendency, especially after the collapse of the housing market in the US. We saw this tendency of financial corporations targeting farmland around the world. And Brazil is one of the main regions where this tendency has happened. Here in the US, it's also happening in other parts of the world, but Brazil is a main target. So we have been looking, doing research, and also building an international campaign to denounce that, and also supporting rural communities that are resisting displacement and violence. And although the main target of these financial corporations is land, is control over land, in order to justify land speculation, speculating with the price of land, they encourage the expansion of monocropping of commodities, which has a huge impact on climate change. We know that together with fossil fuels, agribusiness is a main cause of climate change, because it's a system that depends on chemical inputs based on fossil fuels. So we are not talking only about isolated communities in these remote regions in Brazil. We are talking about issues that have to do with all of us. And there are two main players in this process of land speculation. One is a pension fund based here in the US, TAA or TAA CREF, and many university professors and staff are clients of TAA. And another one is the Harvard University Endowment Fund. So these are two leading players in this process of speculating with farmland, which is really what is funding the expansion of monocropping of agricultural commodities. So we have been building a solidarity movement in the US and also in Europe and Canada, because TAA also receives funding from other pension funds in other countries, especially from Europe and Canada, because this process also represents a risk for clients of TAA. Because once they control land, they displace local communities, they destroy the biodiversity, they destroy the water sources with chemical inputs, that then, of course, the soil is destroyed, the water sources are polluted, and the productivity in the land starts to decrease as well. So, you know, that type of, I don't like to call this investment, because investment usually has a positive connotation. So it's more like targeting and control over land and destroying the natural resources. That also represents a risk for clients. So, you know, we are building this solidarity campaign with several universities and other organizations here in the US, and also showing that when you have a large corporation, a large pension fund, setting up another corporations, in that case, for example, TAA Global Agriculture, to speculate with farmland, that drives the price of land up and puts rural communities at risk of displacement, and small farmers as well. And just to be clear, you know, the agribusiness corporations, they don't produce food. They mainly produce 4 commodities in Brazil: timber, beef for export, soy for export, and sugar. So the indigenous movements in Brazil are calling for a boycott of these 4 commodities. And of course, it's very difficult to do an individual boycott of these commodities. So what we are calling for is that we work on policy. So the work with Congress members here in the US is very important because we can work, for example, on trade policy to have higher tariffs or to have a boycott of those commodities. So the work here, the solidarity work that we can do here in the US has a very important impact in terms of helping to support communities that are resisting in the land. And also, especially now with the pandemic, we know that one of the main causes of the pandemic is the loss of biodiversity. So again, we are talking about a global issue of climate change or protecting our natural resources and our biodiversity. So what I'm doing now then is helping support this coordination of several organizations here in the US that are part of our campaign. For example, Friends of the Earth, Amazon Watch, ActionAid, GRAIN, which is an organization in Canada. So also other organizations in Europe like FIAN. So we built this campaign, and you can look for information on our website. Is Stop Land Grabs. It's a collective website in addition to the websites of our organizations that have a lot of information. We have a toolkit to work with universities now. And so we have, regular meetings and several activities, and we support local communities directly in Brazil. So I hope that we can also have support of other organizations and other people who would like to be involved, especially on this issue of land and natural resources in Brazil. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Very punctual as well. Michael Fox is our next guest, and he is an independent multimedia journalist based in Brazil, Florianopolis, and a former editor of the Natalie Report on the Americas. He reports often for PRI's The World, and he is developing a new podcast titled Brazil on Fire, about the country's descent towards authoritarianism under President Bolsonaro. Michael.
Thank you so much, James. Pleasure to be here. I think I want to pick up where, James, you were mentioning very briefly about this U.S. Capitol question and the connections with Brazil, because I think this is key, and it's important for people to understand the similarities with Trump, with Bolsonaro, between their styles. Obviously, you mentioned how Bolsonaro is very much the Trump of the tropics in many ways, and that's what they've been calling him for a very long time. But it's taken to a whole other level. We've seen under the Bolsonaro administration, he's brought in evangelical leaders as many of his ministers, conspiracy theorists. In fact, his philosophical guru, a man by the name of Olavo de Carvalho, who was credited for really being involved and important for this whole resurgence of the kind of the far right philosophy, because he was training students in his online classes, far right philosophy, in the kind of the late 2000s, early 2010s. And he actually lives outside of Richmond, and he was interviewed just a couple of days ago by a far right YouTube site called Jovem Pan, and he actually came out. He has a million followers on his YouTube page. He actually came out saying, well, listen, it's very clear that Biden lost the election in the United States. And it's very, very clear that there's no way he could have won. And so he's spreading that same misinformation that he's kind of built the ideology and the agenda for the far right. And he's spreading that across Brazil at the same time as Bolsonaro for months has been talking about fraud in the Brazilian elections. He's been talking about the fact that the voting systems are not reliable. And so this is the reason why when we saw the kind of invasions of the US Capitol, what people in Brazil are saying that's insane happening in the United States. But second, they're saying, boy, this is where we could be at in just 2 years. In fact, former President Lula tweeted that very thing out. He said, this could be us, except worse. And the worse is the question, because when we look at Brazil, people know this. Obviously, James has written a lot about this in all of his work. But, the dictatorship was not that long ago. Brazil has battled with kind of this authoritarian dictatorship ideology for a very long time. And in the lead up even to Bolsonaro's own election, we saw people out in the streets calling for military intervention. We've seen them throughout this entire year, at protests against the Supreme Court, at protests against Congress, out in the streets. In fact, Bolsonaro has joined many of them, in which they're calling, for the closure of the Supreme Court and Congress and things like that. And so this is why this is even more concerning in a place like Brazil, in which the democratic institutions are not, or the fear is that they're not as strong. Now, they have been holding and pushing back on Bolsonaro and his supporters in many ways. Some of his more radical supporters have themselves been locked up for their own involvement in a fake news scheme that happened earlier this year. But also Brazil, in the same way that we have in the United States, where we have a growing white supremacist movement, which is what Trump has really invigorated, inspired, particularly in these last couple of weeks. We've seen the same thing with Bolsonaro here in Brazil. There's more than 300, at least according to an anthropologist who's kind of the latest woman who's been really following this stuff. There's more than 300 neo-Nazi cells in Brazil alone. And of course, Brazil was the country with the largest Nazi party outside of Germany in the 1930s. And so these details are kind of the things that are extremely important to understand. And of course, Bolsonaro, as we've mentioned, has rolled out kind of his attack. He's been trying to push to open up mining on indigenous communities. Of course, been empowering large landowners and illegal land grabbers and loggers in the Amazon and elsewhere to set those fires, to take those lands, to move into indigenous territories. And they've been doing it at higher and higher rates, which is extremely concerning. And so these types of things are kind of the details that we in the United States understand. And when we put that into context, we start to understand just how devastating Bolsonaro is now, but also how concerning it may look for the coming years, because it's really difficult to say what exactly may happen. Now, at the same time, we also saw when Biden won this last election, there was a lot of hope in Brazil, because as James pointed out, a lot of people were saying, well, this is what Bolsonaro has really formed himself on Trump's image. And so if Trump has lost here in 2 years, well, then that looks, we're moving in a positive direction for Bolsonaro's own presidency. In fact, he has been dropping in the polls, and we now have disapproval ratings well over 50%, just we saw a couple days ago. This last election was pretty disastrous for Bolsonaro. Of all the people that he came out to support, only a couple actually won. And of course, part of that has to do with the fact that he kind of jumped ship from the party that he was elected with, tried to form a new party, and that didn't work. But all these details are happening at the same time. It was very clear that the far right movement that really swung into power on Bolsonaro's coattails, they did not do well in these last local November elections. So that's very positive. Of course, they've also now cut the emergency stipend for informal workers, for low-wage workers. And that was happening from March. They were receiving 600 reais, and that was cut down to 300 reais. And that was now cut at the very end of December. And so that may also be responsible for Bolsonaro's kind of hit that he's taken. But so it's important to understand that that's kind of where things might be for Bolsonaro going forward. But of course, you just never know. And even his supporters, he has roughly the same percentage as Trump has always had and whatnot. Now, the MST social movements have been resisting kind of across the country throughout this period of time. It's been difficult, obviously, over this last year because of the pandemic, because of social isolations and the need for socially isolating amid as coronavirus is ticking off. And I'm not going to talk about that because I know we have more people to talk about that. But the MST is an interesting case, the landless workers movement, because they've been donating tons of food around the country in order to respond to this crisis. That's one of the really interesting kind of active movements that a lot of people haven't been that aware that it's been actually happening on the ground. And according to the latest reports from just a couple of days ago, there was they donated in southern Brazil at least 850 tons of food to low-income communities, the poor communities, trying to get people food that need it in these times that are really hard. But at the same time, they've been facing evictions, and we've seen that up and down the country, evictions in Paraná in particular, several different going on. And then there was a case of Quilombo Grande that was in Minas Gerais, and that was kind of the big one that a lot of people heard about. That's when the police brought in tanks, they brought in helicopters, they actually set fires to move communities off of their land and whatnot. So that was, and that continues to happen. In fact, under the pandemic itself, we saw evictions double in just the first few months and happening. And many people believe it had to do with the fact that the local governments realized that they could move and evict, and there wouldn't be as big of a protest and response because people weren't out in the streets because of the fact that they were socially isolating. Now, at the same time in June, when folks in the United States responded, and really hit the streets in order to respond to Black Lives Matter and these very necessary protests, then people started to get out in the streets here in Brazil at around the same time. And that was really important to show some movement earlier in the year. And of course, we saw big Black Lives Matter protests spark off again, with the death of Freitas, a Black man in Porto Alegre who was killed by security guards, beaten by security guards, and choked outside of a Carrefour supermarket. This is just a week after the first round of the November elections. And so that was really disturbing. And again, it lights off this reality in Brazil, this racist reality in Brazil, in which social movements are fighting for their lives. And that continues to be, what we've seen, occupations across Sao Paulo standing up. In fact, and I interviewed a human rights lawyer by the name of Dito Barbosa just about a year and a half ago. And he said, this is such an extremely serious moment. You can almost say that we're living in a police state, a state of exception. And I thought that was a quote that really stuck with me. Of course, the Free Lula movement was extremely important in terms of invigorating social movements here in Brazil, through 2018, 2019. And I think there's a couple of, I wanted to just mention very briefly, James, you mentioned Alcântara.
Another minute or two.
You mentioned Alcântara, and that's, of course, the satellite launch center that the U.S. and Brazil have now signed a deal. And according, it was very early of last year that the U.S. that Brazil has now called for the eviction of hundreds of traditional Black families, Quilombo communities in that same region. I was with them in late 2019, and the situation is really, really dire. And this is someplace where folks in the United States really need to be heard. And particularly, we don't know what it might mean with the new Biden administration coming in, but that is one area that those evictions are on hold, but they are pending, and we still don't know what that might mean, for the coming months, the coming years. And it's a place where the U.S. is directly in contact because they want to expand that satellite launch center, and through the expansion, then move on to these Quilombola communities. So I think overall, the situation obviously is not good. It is so much of a parallel and a repeat. Bolsonaro traveled to meet with Trump 4 times in just 2 years in his presidency. They've signed tons of agreements, including Amazon development for private corporations and agreements over anti-corruption and trade just this last October. And he continues to say that, Trump is my north, and he's going to be, whether or not Trump is in power or not. And I think the one thing I just want to leave with this one last point is whether or not, obviously Trump is going to be out of office in just a couple of weeks here, but the situation that he has unleashed in the United States is going to continue for a very long time. And that's the same thing we're seeing in Brazil as the evangelical movement continues to grow, libertarian movements and conspiracy theories continue to garner force with Bolsonaro. And I think that's where we need to be concerned of whether or not Bolsonaro is in power. He's created something and opened this playing field for something that could continue for a very long time.
Thank you very much, Michael. Again, thank you for abiding by the time as well. Our final 4th panelist is Luisa Dalmata Machado Fernandez. She has a PhD and a master's in public health, as well as a master's in public administration. She is currently a researcher for René Rochot Institute at the Fiocruz, which is a public health institution in Rio de Janeiro, and a consultant at the Family Health Foundation of Bahia for a project developing an electronic health platform. She is a member of the social movement Ideologies, Feminisms and Health, the U.S. Network of Democracy in Brazil, and Defend Democracy in Brazil Committee in New York. Luisa.
Thank you, Jim. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's an honor to be able to speak about what's happening in Brazil with such people that understand a lot about the country. My task today is to talk about an overview of the COVID-19 pandemic and the current public health crisis. So it's not an easy task. A lot has happened in the past year, so I'll try my best here. I first want to acknowledge that we have now, today, 204,000 Brazilians dead due to COVID-19. This number is important to keep in mind. It is a consequences of the lack of health policies we've seen so far. So at this point, I think everybody heard about Bolsonaro, and it's clear that he's not a supporter also of our public health system, which we call it Sistema Único de Saúde, or SUS. It's a health system that 76% of population depends exclusively on it. And despite access to health being a constitutional right since 1988, the current president has never supported it, has defunded the health system, has intended to expand the market and put in regulated small private health insurances, destroyed any successful program that was designed before to qualify the health system, such as the more doctored programs, Mais Médicos, or PEMAC, which was a program that used health qualified measures to improve financing. They were over before the pandemic. But even at that point, with Bolsonaro's attacks, if someone asked me, okay, would Brazil be ready to face an epidemic or even a pandemic, I would say, okay, it will be a little bit hard, but we'll manage. We can actually face this. We've learned a lot with the Zika epidemic here. And our family health teams are spread throughout the country, have good, effective bonds with the population. And those bands and those teams are important assets. They are. However, no one was counting on how strongly the underfunding had already impacted the infrastructure, and did not measure I could not measure how it would be to go through a public health crisis without a political and qualified technical leadership. So as we have repeated throughout the past year, the government did not prepare for the arrival of the virus, and I'll bring some examples of how they did not prepare. So there's no national plan built in agreement with the Health Commissioners Council. Instead, we saw lack of communication, a disputing strength that went to the federal courts to decide who could enforce a mask or a quarantine mandate. Centralized acquisitions of individual protective equipment, tests, reagents, medications, medical equipment were either late or never happened. And when the states actually managed to organize a purchase internationally, the federal government stopped it. So tests that were actually bought eventually, they have expired, not once, but twice now, stored at airports, while we have no massive testing programs. So instead of supporting research and adequately spending the extraordinary money authorized to COVID-19, the government decided to actually invest in therapies without clinical efficacy, such as chloroquine. They actually had the army producing more chloroquine than necessary. This has created a lot in several situations that have been a problem and putting people's health threatening. So the government, not only the federal government, but also many states and municipalities, they failed to not integrate the public and private hospitals beds during the monitoring regulation integrated. This is ensuring our legislation, and it should have been done to guarantee access to all. And now we are at a situation that we don't even have the full information of how many hospital beds we have available. So the most vulnerable population was not protected. So prisoners have died more than 1,600. Even prisoner employees have died over 200 ones. Maternal health mortality is high among women with COVID, and the same with indigenous populations. So without guidance and articulated national plan with the divisions of responsibility between regions, most of the monies that was used by the states and municipalities, including a little bit they eventually received from the federal government, was invested in the hospital infrastructure. But we got to a situation that we actually had the field hospitals, the emergency hospitals empty here in Minas Gerais, for instance, while we had in other regions people dying at the door of a hospital that was closed because there was absolutely no way they could ensure someone else entering. So the Congress authorized an emergency budget, and 15% of this was not used. That amounts to 81 billion reais. So this sum might change a little bit because of the emergency checks that is still underway. However, the reality that there was money available and it was not used. The same if we look only to the Ministry of Health budget that was assigned to transfer to municipalities and states, 56%, only 56% was actually transferred. The rest was not used. So this is one big problem. There's also no investment in strengthening primary health care that could have helped in contact tracing, early diagnosis. People were pushed away from medical centers with fear, and now we've seen chronic diseases that were not monitored, over 30% of increases of mental health diseases, and the post-COVID syndrome, and they're overloading our primary health care services. So the situation is not only worse because our health system, despite all those barriers, still function. It still has health professionals and leaders that could actually apply their previous knowledge and experience to fight this situation. Although health professionals are actually paying with their lives. This is very important to highlight because we have a serious situation here. In 2021, over 30 nursing health professionals have already died, and the Nurse Associations has published some data that they have also an international comparison, and Brazil is responsible for a third of the deaths among those health professionals. The federal government did not make any substantial investments in hiring health professionals to support the states. At the beginning of the pandemic, they tried. They started to point to some national deployment of professionals. I even was registered to it. No one ever heard anything about it. They were not able to deploy it to the first state that was people were dying, and currently, and it has not continued. So there were absolutely no support. So if all of those mistakes were not sufficient, we are currently facing a crisis involving immunization, right? Once more, we have repeated the same mistakes at the beginning of the pandemic. Delaying ensuring the national acquisition of vaccines doses, and the supposedly national immunization plan was not even discussed with the health commissioners' councils. So it does not focus on the most vulnerable population, and does not predict any investments in infrastructure or hiring health professionals, among other worrisome points. We can talk more about that later. So it is pretty important to see, like, vaccination, immunization for us here in Brazil is an asset. We've always known that we had an excellent national program. Since the 70s, Brazil has a national immunization program, and we have been successful in many ways. We had seen a decrease in coverage, and this was a problem, for instance, for the past 2 years of measles. And now we are seeing an even higher problem with COVID-19. So the federal government intends that the 38,000 local vaccination, we call them rooms, but it's like they're inside small family health clinics. So they're supposed to cover all the immunization for COVID-19. The problem is those places are at this point not fully equipped and do not have enough health professionals to maintain care to all the other functions they need to do and vaccinate people 8 hours a day, 7 days a week, right? So that would be not, they don't have the conditions of sufficient health professionals to safely do their work. So the federal government also expects states and municipalities to use existing supplies, such as the syringe, for the emergency vaccination, which obviously it's needed since they were not able to ensure and to buy it timely, the necessary amount. But there's still a question here. So we have a national immunization program that has incorporated, if I'm not mistaken, 19 different vaccines for children, adolescents, and elderly. So those syringes will need to be used throughout the year for this this program and this calendar. So how this is going to be replaced? And the federal government has not given any answer to this demand. So at this point, we don't have any vaccines approved in Brazil yet. Two of them have requested emergency use to our agency, which is called Anvisa. But this agency is now led by military, in several different important capacities and not by technicians, how it always used to be. And the government is using its powers through Anvisa as a political card and to dispute political views and positions with the governor of São Paulo. So São Paulo is a state here that has, it's the richest state in Brazil. So it has its own research institute that is called Butantan that has developed in partnership with China a vaccine, but the federal government has been creating several problems to approve the current vaccine. And has also generating fake news around it. So also Fiocruz, which is the institute I work for, is also developing a vaccine with AstraZeneca, although it is not ready to produce yet. So they are actually now buying from India, which should have happened like months ago because we already knew we would not have the capacity to produce vaccines before February. So all those actions should be organized and seen as one complementary action. When you start to do that and you are absolutely not organized, what we've seen on the past few weeks was the private sector wanted to step in. So they wanted to buy their own vaccines and offer the vaccines for the 25% of the population that actually pay for private health insurances. So the problem here is the private sector in Brazil is complementary to our SUS, and it should be used as such, as how it has been during vaccination campaigns, like supporting any places that we need more health professionals and more places to do the actual vaccination points and things like that. But purchasing right now any quantity of doses by a private sector it's going to create a dispute over prices, and it's going to decrease the number of doses available to the public sector. And it's not a problem only to Brazil; it's a problem worldwide, right? And we know that vaccinations to work need to be equitable, and those with private health plan cannot have any kind of privilege over this. So with the effectiveness we're seeing of the vaccinations today, our capacity to use the vaccines that have 95% efficacy is really, really low, and it would be to a really specific target public. So we would have to use other vaccines that have among 50% to 78% efficacy, which means we need to vaccinate over 70% of the Brazilian population to have some control of the virus. So beyond the structural problems of the health system, we will face a challenge of the vaccine itself, which most of them needs 2 doses of application. So you have to coordinate which vaccination when the interval of times. And that's why we insist in the federal government joins and participates from this plan, because we know that doing that separately state by state will just increase inequality, right?
Luisa, para finalizar.
Yeah, three seconds. So what we need right now is a strong, clear, unique communication campaign we haven't had so far. So actually government has been feeding fake news about a vaccine. And we will have a big problem here because we're talking about vaccines that reduce the virus circulation, but essentially the most protect against severe cases. So that means that distance, mask, and hygiene measures that have already been difficult here to be implemented in Brazil will be necessary still for a long time. In an optimistic scenario, we would need 7 months to a year to vaccinate Brazilian population, at least at 7%. We're not an optimistic scenario, obviously. So that's worrisome, and that's how long the pandemic still can last here in Brazil. Depends on the dates that we start. We still don't know when we're going to start. Our Minister of Health said we're going to start on the D-Day. Hopefully, the D-Day comes soon. So I know my speech is also not very optimistic up to this point. but I wanted to gather this overview of the problems we've seen and focus on the federal government. But we do have a lot of examples and a lot of good things being done, and a lot of things that to learn from. We do have a lot of resistance from national organizations and from social movements, and people are really trying to come together to defend our health system. So I hope throughout the discussion I can talk and bring a little bit of more optimistic view of the situation here in Brazil. Thank you.
Thank you, Luisa. So we're going to open the chat room, if Omar can do that, so that people who have questions can send them through the chat room, and then Heather will be kindly gathering them and presenting them. In the meantime, we wanted to give an opportunity for the panelists to share any other thoughts that they might have forgotten to say or in response to the other panelists, and then we'll open it up for questions. Our event will be lasting until 8 o'clock, and so we have a good hour for debate and discussion. So if any of the four panelists, including myself, wants to jump in there, feel free to do that.
Yes, I wanted to mention the case of the Alcantara base, the spaceship base that Michael talked about. We participated, my organization participated in a very large international campaign to defend the Alcantara base. That was together with the campaign against the FTAA, the Free Trade Area of the Americas, right? And at that time we had an important victory because during the beginning of the 2000 decade, the Cardoso government had an agreement to use the Alcantara base. And because of this large continental mobilization, that agreement was canceled in 2003 when Lula got elected his first term. So that was a very large victory of a hemispheric campaign in support of the Quilombola communities in Alcantara. And my organization had a lawsuit that went up to the Supreme Court in Brazil to guarantee land rights for the Quilombo communities, because they have the same land rights as indigenous communities in Brazil, according to the ILO convention and international law and Brazilian law. So I think this is a very important point for organizing here in the US, because the local communities are also very well organized. And I think it's an important point to put in the agenda for doing solidarity work. Another point I think is that to look at the role of US corporations. I mentioned financial corporations, international pension funds, because of this new tendency of financialization of land, speculation with farm land. But the Brazilian agribusiness, all the environmental destruction that is happening there, they will not survive if they didn't have partnerships with agribusiness corporations from the US. So, like all the corporations that produce the chemical inputs, and also the trading corporations that speculate with the price of agricultural commodities, for example. There are multinational large trading corporations. So I think that it's very important. For example, now I think there is an opportunity with the new Green Deal, the discussion about how new policy here in the US, but I think looking at the role of US corporations abroad is a very important point for organizing here in the US as well. And then just a third point in terms of connections between Trump and Bolsonaro, I think that it's not a coincidence that they have such a similar rhetoric and similar policies as well, because there is, I think, an international far-right organization that coordinates. It's not a coincidence that this is happening, right? So I think it's very important to connect the dots and also to organize from an international perspective. Activists here in the US that do domestic work, I think need to look at how to do more international work as well. And organizations in Brazil and in other countries, I think everything that can be done in the US has a huge impact in terms of policy of course, because of the role of the US in the US foreign policy all over the world. So I think this is a very important discussion. And anyway, just to put out a few more points for discussion. Thank you.
So people should be encouraged to send questions to the chat room. Michael, would you like to jump in?
I would, just to say a couple of very quick things. I think Maria Luisa, and just to kind of roll off of what you were saying about US corporations, I think one of the things that we're seeing in Brazil that has not been talked about enough, particularly in the international media, is kind of this slow push for privatizations. When we talk about privatizations in Brazil, it's interesting because it's happening in a lot of times as auctions or as slow selling off certain percentages of state companies and things like that. I think one really good example is BR Distribuidora, which is one of the largest gas station chains in Brazil. It was state-owned as of just a couple of years ago. The Brazilian state has slowly sold it off from Petrobras, and this is part of this move. Of course, Petrobras is the state oil company. It was kind of involved in the whole kind of corruption scandal and investigations that happened a couple of years ago. And so they've used that as a tool to be able to kind of gut it slowly. And so it's now been slowly sold off. And who's bought it up? Some of the major shareholders are now major US asset firms, including Lazard, JP Morgan, Vanguard, and BlackRock. Many of these same firms are firms that are also shareholders in many of the corporations that are in the Amazon and doing work in the Amazon and pushing more development in the Amazon. And so there's these questions that are really important to understand, that this privatization push, which is happening particularly from Finance Minister Paulo Guedes, he said very, very clearly this is where he's going. As of 2019, he said he wanted to sell off 17 state companies, and that's the direction that they're trying to do. In fact, with Banco do Brasil, which is the state bank, they just announced, I think it was yesterday, that they'd be firing 5,000 employees and closing 361 branches. And this was just a couple of weeks after they sold off a credit portfolio to BTG Pactual, the bank that he helped to found, for less than 20% of its value. So these types of things are happening, but they're happening slowly. And so we're not hearing about it. It's not big news. It's not being sold for, and so it just kind of, you see it on Reuters and you see it kind of go through. But this slow privatization, and who is benefiting very much are US asset firms and US corporations or international corporations. And so in order to understand that, I think is key for people to keep in mind. And one point about that you mentioned, Maria Luisa, this kind of international far right kind of unity of it absolutely is united. In fact, Eduardo Bolsonaro, who is Bolsonaro's son, who's a congressman, he himself is the South American coordinator of Steve Bannon's far right movement, right? And so the connections there run deep. He's met with Steve Bannon many times. Bannon knows all the Bolsonaro people, and they're all friends and whatnot, including Olavo de Carvalho, who I mentioned earlier, who lives in Richmond, Virginia. So there's all these connections that we need to understand and keep in mind. Particularly, it's particularly important for U.S. kind of organizing at this moment.
Let me just jump in and make a few comments as well. And I think I'm going to respond to one of the questions that the panelists asked as well, which was what I was going to talk about anyway. Although I'm a specialist in Brazil and I teach Brazilian history, and I always teach my students that teaching Brazilian history means you never can really predict what's going to happen because things change so fast. So to talk about the elections in 2022 is like talking about a decade from now in a lot of ways in terms of the dynamic change of political situation in Brazil. But one of the big questions that is being asked is, what is the strategy for 2022, especially because in spite of the recent indication that Bolsonaro's support is plummeting, he still has significant popular support, not only the economic assistance that people receive, which kind of seem to have increased his support, but also a certain amount of affinity among evangelical Christians, sectors of the middle class, and even poor sectors who see in his moralism and his emphasis on the family and morality and patriotism and nationalism things that kind of give them a certain amount of hope and pride in the country. Sérgio Moro, the former prosecutor of the judge in the car wash Lava Jato investigation, who then was the Ministry of Justice, remains quite popular, as does the governor of the state of São Paulo, João Doria, who is competing with Bolsonaro around the question of the vaccination. And then there's the question of the left having a candidate, whether it's Lula, whether he manages to kind of escape from all of the accusations against him and being allowed to run, or whether the left fields another candidate as a united candidate. So I think it's very early to predict what's going to happen in 2022. But even though I love to talk about Brazil, the last month, all I've been doing is talking about the United States and Portuguese and Brazil on all my lives. And so I've been thinking a lot about trying to draw analogies and thinking about the two countries. And just as I don't think we can understand the invasion of the Capitol on last Wednesday without understanding the victorious election in Georgia on Tuesday, which flipped the Senate. But the most important thing about Georgia for me was the strategy that was developed by Stacey Abrams and other groups to build a broad coalition and do grassroots work to organize voters, especially voters who had not voted in a long time, many African-American voters and others, but building a coalition basically with progressive whites and Latinos and Asians and other groups. But a core block was progressive whites with that. So the idea of building a unity of forces in Georgia managed to do spectacularly well, aided by the incompetency of Trump and the ways he subverted that election for many ways. And I think that is the real answer to progressive forces in Brazil, which is that the phenomena of the Workers' Party coming to power after governing in municipalities and then state governments, but coming to federal power and focusing most of the major energy of those progressive movements that emerged in the 70s and the 80s in the process of democratization, meant kind of losing the energy of the rank and file and the grassroots groups that existed throughout the country and the way political parties had those grassroots links. And that space was occupied, which had also been occupied by progressive wings of the Catholic Church, by evangelical Christians and right-wing ideologies. And so one of the major tasks, and I think this is another way in which the situation in the United States can be an example, is doing a resurgence of deep organizing in grassroots communities over the next period of time to build the possibilities of a united front, of a left which is in the process of rejuvenating itself. And that's a long question I won't try to address at this moment, in the process of building a united front that might have to be a very broad, much broader democratic front at the end of the day than people wish, in order to defeat Bolsonaro if there is a second round in which the left doesn't manage to be one of the two candidates. But I think that's a process that is very dynamic, and many things are going to be happening between now and the electoral process of 2022.
Sure. Thanks, everyone, for sharing your thoughts so far. This conversation has been great. So we have some good questions coming through in the chat as well. From Patricia, she asks, yesterday, the US military stated it embraces the Constitution and not extremism. What is the position of the armed forces in Brazil vis-a-vis Bolsonaro, vis-a-vis the rule of law?
Well, I think I'm just going to make one point. And the military in Brazil, since the end of the dictatorship, has basically tried to be more like in the backstage, not get involved directly, not get involved directly with the political process. But of course, you know, that is always, once we had such a long period of military dictatorship, so that's part, of course, of the recent history of the country, and of course that has a huge influence. But what's happening now with Bolsonaro is something that we haven't seen since the end of the military dictatorship, which is that military officers are a major part of the Bolsonaro cabinet. They are in key positions of power, even in agencies that that has nothing to do with their role. For example, the Anvisa, which is the agency that approves the vaccine, and it's supposed to be a scientific institution. The indigenous institution, the official indigenous institution in Brazil is also now controlled by military officers. So they are basically everywhere. The vice president is a military person. So this is a very new phenomenon in Brazil. And I think we are dealing with a situation now that really what the coup against President Dilma opened the space for this situation in which we had neoliberal parties really embracing a very extreme conservative vision. And also, this is the part of the military that is more conservative. So it's an alliance that brings back the fascist views in the country. And that, of course, is also is highlighted by Bolsonaro's rhetoric. So it is a very dangerous situation in Brazil that we haven't seen in a long time. But again, I think that was the result of dismantling democracy by impeaching President Dilma, although there was no crime. So, that was a parliamentary coup, and that opened the space for the Bolsonaro and the rise of the military forces in Brazil again.
Mike's going to say something, but there's just a small follow-up here that I'll just toss out while we're still discussing the question of the military. Do you think Marão's split from Bolsonaro is going to change the relationship with the military at all? So Mike, maybe that or the overall question.
I'm going to take the overall question real quick, but just say that I think one of the ironic and fascinating things that we've seen over these last couple of years is how, in many ways, the military has actually been a stabilizing force. This is not necessarily a good thing, but it's a stabilizing force for Bolsonaro's kind of far right agenda, has tried to almost rein him in many ways. So I'm not saying that's necessarily been a positive thing when we see military officials in all these other areas, but it is something to note that's important in that it's always been kind of, and this kind of tags into this next question, been Mourão and other people have been kind of trying to pull Bolsonaro back when he's gone too far out on a limb or said things that are too crazy. They've been trying to balance it out. And I think this plays into what Maria Luisa was talking about, how the military is there in more force than ever, but still trying to take this kind of backstage and kind of move things kind of still with this facade of democracy and whatnot.
For a connection here, talking about our Minister of Health is a military supposedly known for being good at logistics, and that's supposedly why he was placed there, because we would not need anyone experience any type of pandemic or epidemics or clinical, any type of public health backgrounds, but only someone to do logistics and distribute things across the country. So although some people say he has lost a lot of support, so he's a high rank military in Brazil, and he has to sort of step out to assume this position as Minister of Health. And some people said he lost respect inside the army. And other people because he was many times he came on and declared something, we're going to buy all the vaccines available. And then the next day, Bolsonaro would say, no, we're not buying. I'm the president. We're not buying anything that comes from China because China is the one causing the pandemic. So he had to retreat himself, and then he just caught himself in the middle of this situation. He's a Minister of Health, and he's not even able to come in and tell the population and say, we're starting vaccinations at 10th of February, whatever date. He doesn't have this authority. So we're talking about, there's a difference here about the official position of the military body in Brazil and the ones that have decided to step in inside the government and actually support and obey a lot of what Bolsonaro is asking them to do. They are in fact now saying they're going to approve the vaccines in a live, probably Facebook, because that's how Bolsonaro likes, a live Facebook room, a situation room, where everyone in Anvisa is going to vote if they are approving the emergency use of the 2 vaccines that have asked for it. This has never ever happened. This is a scientific clinical assessment of the documents presented to the agency, and now we have 5 people. I don't know who all the 5 are going to be, but we have 5 people leading the Anvisa that are from the military branch, and they're going to vote if they agree or not on a live stream. So I think this position has also a big impact on everything that's going on to the public health crisis.
We have another question here related to health. So it's a question for Luisa from Matthew. From your point of view, has the private health sector, both in terms of private health provisioning and insurance, played a significant role in creating the structural instabilities in the public health system that we are now witnessing with the pandemic? Or is this the fault of the mismanagement of the Bolsonaro government alone?
So unfortunately, this is not only Bolsonaro's fault. I wish it was. We could just take him out and fix things. We wanted a system exclusively public. We lost that in 1988 and had a public system with supplemental private system. And since we have an underfunded public health system from the beginning, we never were able to actually gather the amount of money needed to offer proper and quality care for the population. We've lost a lot of space for the private system that, of course, uses this situation to grow, right? We in many points of time, we have countered that we have a national agency that regulates it. Sometimes I compare with United States, saying, you know what Obamacare law did for health plans over there? We actually have an agency doing this, regulating the plans as problems come up. Situation is when you don't want plans to be regulated and you want to give them more space and want to weaken the public health system, then you just underfund the regulator agency. Or, I mean, we haven't even heard talking about the agency during the pandemic, while the agency should be taking decisions side by side of the Minister of Health to make sure the 2 systems are complementary. So I think this is a long-lasting problem, but it was the intentions to destroy and the public health system and strengthen the private sector are clearly part of the Bolsonaro government, which has worsened the problem. And also that has started also actually with Temer government. That there was a resolution that froze our health system budget for the next 20 years. So it's a growing problem and complex. I hope I answer a little bit of that.
We also have a question here for Maria Luisa, kind of connecting the dots over with Europe. This question is from Miriam. So Maria Luisa, what do you think about the Macron declaration today on stopping buying soybeans from Brazil? Is this a window of opportunity in what you're speaking about, resisting land grabs?
Yes, I think actually this is the only message that the Bolsonaro government would understand in terms of, stopping the expansion of agribusiness in Brazil, which is a main cause of environmental destruction. And I think other countries should do the same. I think we need to build systems, food systems that are based on local food production and ecological food production. here in the US and also in Europe, there is a lot of support, I think, from public opinion to support ecological and local agriculture. But in the global south, what we see is continuing expanding large plantations of agricultural commodities that they don't benefit Brazil. You know, they benefit a few large agribusiness corporations, including multinational corporations, and it's not about food production. More than 70% of food production for local markets is produced by small farmers in Brazil and all over the world. So I think this is a, you know, the continuing the plantation model is a neo-colonial model that is very destructive and has a huge impact on climate change. So I think we need to move towards a system of food sovereignty. And Brazil should be able to produce enough food for internal markets without destroying the biodiversity, destroying the environment. Because once you destroy the water sources, you destroy the soil, then the productivity would decrease as well. Your agricultural productivity would decrease. So I think we don't see large plantations of soy in Europe, in the US. You know, this is a colonial system. Let's leave this to Brazil, or large plantations of sugar. So I think moving towards a different type of food system everywhere in Europe, here in Brazil, is key, because it's a key policy to deal with climate change as well. You know, we cannot deal with climate change if we don't transform our food systems.
We have a question here, kind of going back to this, sort of the parallels that some of you were discussing between the situation in the United States and in Brazil. It's a question from Anastasia. Are the tactics and ideologies of Brazilian evangelicals in politics similar to their counterparts in the United States?
It seems like it's a simple and a very complex question at the same time. There's lots of similarities in the way in which in the United States, evangelical Christians made a political decision to involve themselves in politics and become a political force, and have grown and played a very, very important role in the Republican Party. And the way in which the major evangelical Christian churches, some of which were based on missionaries coming from the United States to Brazil, such as the Assembly of God, but others which are very indigenous to Brazil, the Igreja Universal Reino de Deus, the Universal Church of the Kingdom of God, is as a church really built by Brazilian evangelical Christians as a multi-billion-dollar business and a religious operation. They have really engaged dramatically in politics and have a very, very important role, not only in the Bolsonaro government, but also in the parties that compose what is the center-right group within the Congress, which has tremendous influence, and see themselves as power brokers and resource gatherers in the Congress for the projects of their church and their people. There's a way in which budgetary allocations are made to individual projects by Congress people, somewhat like pork barreling in the United States, but it's a different system in which people have a certain amount of money from the federal budget that they can have dedicated to projects that they support. And this is a tremendously valuable way for people to give projects to community health plans or projects that benefit certain communities and communities in which the evangelical churches are growing. And also the churches form electoral bases for religious groups. The Catholic Church progressive wing shrank in the 80s and the 90s significantly, and much of that space among religious people was occupied by the evangelical Christian churches, which, like in the United States, but even much more so, are very entrepreneurial, and that if you go to any working class community, there'll literally be 5 or 6 storefront churches in every street. I mean, it's just an incredibly expansive phenomenon of dynamic pastor building a community, getting a church, getting believers, getting support, building an economic basis of those who are tithing 10% of their income to the church, and then kind of from that building a larger network. That's just one way to approach this, but their influence and their moralistic influence There are issues on abortion, there are homophobic attitudes, traditional ideas of gender have reinforced that turn to the kind of the more right in Brazil in recent years.
I was waiting because you did such a good job, so I was like, all right, we can just move on. But I will just say a couple of very just key things. You know, I was in Rio a couple of years ago, right before Bolsonaro's election. I was interviewing folks in Salas Malafaya's church. He is Bolsonaro's kind of top evangelical preacher. He actually married Bolsonaro with his current wife, and he is kind of the leader of the more vocal kind of far right kind of evangelical pastors. And folks in his church were saying, listen, this isn't, we have a very clear agenda. We know where we're going. We want to be in every place of power. We want to be making decisions and we want to be growing. And that's the direction that they're headed here. And definitely, you know, the same ideology, the same kind of culture war of, you know, like James mentioned about anti-abortion, around what in Brazil has become this idea of gender ideology, but this attack on LGBTQ rights and things like that. And they really employed that in the election of Bolsonaro, and particularly against the protests that were happening, the women's protests that were happening in the lead up to that election, where there were massive protests, just like the women's marches just after Trump came into power. And it was because of the evangelical churches that twisted those on its head and painted them in this kind of negative light, that it didn't have kind of the positive repercussion that people were hoping against Bolsonaro in that lead up to his election. So they're strong, they're playing kind of this culture war card, and they're growing.
Thank you. Another question here for Luisa. Can you share some of the resistance and actions that the healthcare professionals in Brazil are taking? And what are some of the next steps that the international solidarity movement could play in supporting these social movements in healthcare?
May I add something? Just because there's a similar question that talks about how the private health sector might have influenced negatively the public health sector in Brazil. So maybe that's something you could address to Luisa in your response. The question is actually if there has had a significant role in creating structural instabilities for the public health sector, the private one.
So thank you, Natalia. I actually talked a little bit about that before, but I'll try to articulate everything. I think, so what we're trying to do here, everyone that works at usually who works at our public system, I'm not going to say everyone, we've seen this as a very resistant place. Majority of people are civil servants and they work there, and I should say since Fiocruz is also part of our public health system, very passionate and understand our actions as also to sustain and keeping our community-based grassroots health system as part of this resistance. So we've been seeing a lot of community health families, like the small health teams organizing themselves to actually provide and organize the population and provide the correct and proper care that we expect. And that's we're trying to support these situations. We've always so seen this from states or the Northeast Consortium, which I also work in some support and consulting work for them, to create like tools that can actually support properly addressing the pandemic, such as apps that can do not only monitoring and tracking people, but also giving adequately and proper information and geolocalization to know where it's the most impacted places. So I think there was like some outside organizations from the people are trying to go on the sides of the federal government. Also, what we'll be doing as social movements and national associations, it's always like offering countering a different story. Every time the government presents a plan or presents an action and saying, as if this was the best that could be done, representing documents and how to organize it and how should be a national plan could be organized and in defense of life. So in that same line, defending life, we're starting this national coalition with the support of some federal from the executive branch, and we're trying to create this coalition in defense of life to ensure everyone is actually vaccinated in a proper time. So our biggest fear here now is to sort of dispute of this part of people are going to be vaccinated and this other part of people are not going to be vaccinated, which the private health system can make it worse. It can only make it worse if we allow it, but we can also use them in our favor. And there are some that are supportive of actually doing national immunization programs. In that sense, that being said, I think the national coalitions and defending vaccinations equitable worldwide and denouncing leaders they are not doing that, it's going to be a very key and important role here. We are also trying to create a movement that I think we need to go to the streets. I was saying I was inspired with our sisters from Argentina that actually got their rights to abortion approved during the pandemic, and there were thousands and thousands of women dressing in green on the streets, and that was like, if we do not go out to the streets and say we need this, we need to face this pandemic, vaccination for all, and fight for our lives, we're going to end up dying inside our apartments. But as I think Michael mentioned before, it has been hard to mobilize people to go to the streets, which has not been since 2013. It was a different scenario in Brazil. And now people are afraid to go out on the streets because of the pandemic. So we're trying to see that like the best strategy is how can we safely put people on the streets and actually demand our right to life.
We have two questions here speaking to the role of the media. So one of the questions is, do you see any large discrepancies between how Portuguese media, English language media, and Spanish language media describe or report on Brazilian current events across the political spectrum? And the other question is specifically asking folks to speak to the issue of Brazilian media pundits living in Miami and disseminating misinformation in the Brazilian media. The person asking the question is thinking of folks like Rodrigo Constantino, Paulo Figueiredo, grandson of the last dictator, and more recently, Alain dos Santos. So those two questions speaking to the role of the media.
So maybe I could jump in there a little bit. There are more than 1 million Brazilians in the United States. There's always a dispute about the numbers and perhaps a back migration in recent years. Many of them are very working class and working very hard to survive and working 2 jobs, and it's been very, very hard for them during the pandemic. And then there's a sector, a very conservative sector, concentrated in different cities, but especially in the Miami area, which are extremely conservative. Upper middle class, people who have investment apartments there or living the kind of the good life in Miami, far away from what they consider to be dangerous Rio de Janeiro or another dangerous city. And they do reflect a very conservative sector of the immigrant community of Brazilians abroad, reactionary force, and do circulate and produce misinformation about Brazil in some of the local press. On the other hand, we have amazing people like the Brazilian women's group in Boston and Brasil Mulher, the Brazilian women's group in Luisa Galvão, and Defend Democracy in Brazil, which have been very effectively reaching out to parts of the Brazilian community and educating them. It's a minority of the community. The minority of the community is progressive or is critical. There's a large sector that is very influenced by information they've received in Brazil from their families about Bolsonaro and tend to be pro-Bolsonaro. But there's a dispute in the community, and that's something that I think one of the other questions I noticed on the chat board was, how do we break out of the bubbles? And I think that that's one of our biggest challenges, is to reach out as many ways as possible to talk to people across ideological divides and differences, and be patient with people as they're trying to figure out what's happening in Brazil. I can't speak about the Spanish media because I don't follow it, but I do follow very closely the way the US media coverage of Brazil, and I followed that historically over many years, how the media covered Brazil during the dictatorship and beyond. And what is striking is, because I think in part of the analogy people drew between Bolsonaro and Trump, that journalists have been generally very, very good about doing good reporting on Brazil. Now, partially that's because we have amazing people like Michael, who are on the ground, who are living there, who know the language, and can be sophisticated about reporting, as opposed to people who are parachuting in for an event or an activity and writing somewhat superficial analyses of the situation. But in that regard, it's been fairly easy for us to build dialogues with people who don't know much about Brazil, who might read in the New York Times or the Washington Post or listen to something on National Public Radio, things about Brazil, and are hearing a very critical analysis of the situation there. Now, that's not always the case, but it's strikingly good to know that most of the major media outlets have very good reporters writing very critical and insightful and thoughtful analyses of the situation in Brazil. And that helps a lot, the kind of work we're trying to do with people who have a vague notion of what's going on in Brazil, but maybe read things now and then, but are not following it as we do on a daily basis.
I just wanted to jump in here real quick. I agree with all that you just said, James, and many thanks. There is this question of YouTube, and I think we need to expand the question a little bit more, not just from, say, YouTubers who are in Miami and whatnot, but this has become extremely an important means of getting information here in Brazil, and particularly for the youth. And it's a tool that particularly the right youth libertarian movements, MBL, Free Brazil movement, that kind of grew up out of the 2013 protests and then pushed and led to the impeachment of Dilma Rousseff in 2016. These movements were able to really jump on that medium, and they've been really able to utilize this. I've seen my own nephew be caught up in all of this and fall down that rabbit hole, because as a young person, you want to speak, you want to hear from other folks who are that same age, you want to see other people on YouTube, and the right, and particularly youth libertarian movements, have really been able to use this well. And I think that's one of the areas that there's a lot of work that needs to be done, and a lot of research that needs to go still into like how that's playing out. And then in terms of, I also agree that by and large, mainstream coverage of Brazil, of Bolsonaro and, say, Trump has been good. This is one of those cases where, the person in power is authoritarian or, fascist. And so mainstream outlets are good at still being very critical of that. The question comes when you have someone like Lula who comes into power, and that's usually when it gets, that coverage gets that much more complicated. And so, I think that we're in a positive moment in that sense, in that much of the coverage has been very critical, at least some of that mainstream coverage.
Great. We have another question here, speaking to the US role in Brazil. What do we know about how directly the Obama administration was involved with the false impeachment or the parliamentary coup against Dilma Rousseff, and also in the frame up of Lula? And also, the speakers have already spoken to, the U.S. relationship between Trump and Bolsonaro, but maybe you could speak a little bit more specifically about how directly Pompeo and the rest of the Trump administration were and are currently involved in maintaining Bolsonaro in power.
Direct involvement of the coup by the Obama administration, we don't have information as far as that I know of that. What we do have, and what we know very much, is that the Atlas Foundation, which is a libertarian kind of think tank, which has been founding and helping to fund and train libertarians, particularly student libertarian, but libertarian groups around Latin America and around the world. And there was some really good reporting in The Intercept about this back in 2017. And we know that they were funding these student groups in kind of those 2013 protests. And these were some of the same student groups that were out in mass in the street in the lead up to Dilma's impeachment. This is Students for Liberty Brazil, MBL, which I mentioned before, and these are kind of the same people that really took advantage of that, you know, the new medium of the youth medium of YouTube and things like that. So that's something that's very clear about kind of the U.S. role in that whole process, pushing for, you know, the impeachment of and you know, the 2016 coup. Now, what we also know, and this kind of pushes in the direction obviously of tanking the Workers' Party and then of Lula, is we know that the FBI was actively involved in the Lava Jato anti-corruption task force. And particularly we know that from the Vaza Jato leaks, which came from The Intercept and Agência Pública, which did a lot of really good important reporting in the last year and a half or so about the FBI's, well, about many things, the FBI's role, Sergio Moro being in direct contact with, of course, that task force, and he was supposed to be an independent judge, but also that task force saying that they're directly in contact with the FBI. We know that there was roughly 17 to 18 members of the FBI and the US DOJ who were actively involved in that. The Paulo Pimenta, who is a Workers' Party congressman, he actually traveled to the EU Parliament to denounce this a couple of years ago, in 2017, I believe, to denounce the US role in guiding the anti-corruption investigations. And so that is key, and it's important to understand where we are now. You know, Lula's imprisonment, it's very clear that in 2018, he was the front runner in those elections. It was very clear that he was gonna, well, most likely was going to cruise to victory. And his imprisonment and that corruption conviction blocked him from being able to run in 2018, which then opened the door for Bolsonaro. Moro, of course, Judge Sergio Moro, who was the one who convicted Lula on these very suspect charges based on no evidence, but on plea bargain testimony. He then joined Bolsonaro, of course, as his justice minister. He stepped down back early last year over fights over the federal police and control of the federal police, which he said that Bolsonaro was trying to influence. And he's now joined Alvarez and Marsal, which is a US consulting firm who now is in control, is charged with the Old Breck construction company, which was the very construction company, the massive multi-billion-dollar Brazilian construction company, which was at the heart of the anti-corruption, the investigations, which is, you know, had work all around. So he now is at the very consulting firm, which is now charged with this construction firm. And in fact, the Brazilian Bar Association has said he's not actually allowed to practice law or consult legally with people at his new office in the US. He's had long ties with the United States. So those are the details that we know. Those are facts, and those are very solid. But more than that is very difficult. And I would say that, you know, the Trump administration has been important in the sense that it has created a very intimate tie with Bolsonaro. Bolsonaro traveled there 4 times, as I mentioned before, and has been very linked in. And Trump is very much, has always been kind of an idol for Bolsonaro. And so I think that's key, but we don't have, you know, information on more inner dealings and things like that, but except for those very close ties between Trump and Bolsonaro.
The other thing that is important to remember, and it's very sad, but you know, every national state that's a major power uses its information networks, security networks, to gather information from other countries. And we know that President Dilma Rousseff's cell phones were being tapped by U.S. intelligence agency, as were those people involved in the discussions around the pre-salt oil reserves off the coast of Brazil, and there's clearly was an interest, some sectors involved in the the Obama administration, and finding out exactly what was going on with the plans for the auctioning off of oil fields to different companies to do exploitation. Now, to what extent Biden is going to go back to traditional ways in which the United States has felt quite free to intervene in heavy-handed ways in Latin America, or whether it will have a much more democratic approach is something we will have to see. And there will be disputes about that perhaps in the future. So we'll see about that.
So just looking at the time, we have 8 minutes left. It would be great if each one of you could share, for folks who are interested in being involved in supporting the movements and campaigns that you've been speaking about, or getting involved in organizing actions in any way, what are some ways that people can kind of link into what's going on and be involved in these issues? So share some thoughts on organizing and any closing thoughts that you'd like to in the last few minutes here.
So let's go in the order in which we spoke at the beginning. So I'll start, if that's okay. And Heather, thank you so much for doing an excellent job. I was kind of asked to do this job, and I'm glad you took it on. Made me feel less uncomfortable of being a speaker and also a moderator. So I've posted on the chat list the email for the U.S. Network for Democracy in Brazil. We're a decentralized organization, and we encourage people to join locally in groups. And if you're anywhere near the New York, New Jersey area, you should certainly seek out Defend Democracy in Brazil. But if you're interested in being connected with someone in any other part of the country, send us an email or go to our website, which is US Network for Democracy in Brazil, and it has lists of many of our organizations. And if you get blocked by that, you can always find me at Brown University History Department. My email is public, and I'd be more than glad to answer you and help you on anything. I think the most important thing is we and other groups are partner groups such as Amazon Watch and other groups have been involved in many different projects, including the Alcantara project, including thinking about the Green New Deal and how we can intervene in that. And I just encourage people to find a group that they have some affinity to and get involved, and we'll be glad to help you find a path towards a group if you are interested in doing that.
Yeah, thank you so much. And yeah, it's really great to connect with the US network. It's so important to have an organized national network. So it's a very important tool for organizing in the US, because you are dealing with different topics. So and our campaign here is more specific about land grabbing, but we also a part of this national organizing in solidarity with Brazil. So our website is stoplandgrabs.org, and we have petitions, we have a toolkit for people who work at universities, for students who like to organize, faculty and staff at universities, and for people in general who like to get involved in bringing attention to this issue of land speculation, land grabbing, and this process that puts land as a new financial asset, and that has a huge impact on the destruction of the environment and climate change here in the US as well as in Brazil. So it's important to connect with local issues and also international issues. And our organization in Brazil, our website is very easy. It's www.social.org.br for Brazil. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks again, and everybody else for organizing this. This has been fantastic. I really, really appreciate it. And thanks for having me on. Get involved in those organizations, those local groups, please. Great. If you want to follow me, I'm on Twitter, mfox_US. If you have anything to say or want to reach out to me personally, you can check out my website. My email's there, mfox.us. Pretty straightforward. I'm creating this podcast, and it's a deep dive, essentially. It's a deep dive that looks at Brazil's turn toward fascism under Bolsonaro. And it's going to be very audio rich and investigative. It's going to take me several months to do it. I just launched a Kickstarter and it just ended. But if you want to see where I'm headed with that, you can go to Kickstarter Brazil on Fire. And so you can check out kind of what I've been working on. You can hear the trailer and whatnot, and stay in touch. And then, obviously once that is launched, then listen to it. But thank you so much, everybody, for, this has been great. So.
I agree. This is a great discussion. It's always good to hear from different perspectives and everything that's happening around Brazil, and be able to talk of such an engaged audience. I think related to the health movement, I think whoever is in the United States, the best way to connect would be through USNDB or DDB or Defend Democracy Brazil. And we could start doing this bridge. Natalia and I have been discussing and how could we integrate actions and increase our communications. And we have some plans to move forward from this. And as more people are interested in the topic, at the best. For whoever is in Brazil, I think Abrasco and Rede Unida are the two national associations that are among the leaders that will create this movement for the Defend Our Lives, and any national dates or national communications and things to organize and how to organize it in special communities. It will go out through those websites and social media pages. If you're interested in to understand a little bit more behind the scenes, how we are organizing and to connect with local groups, we're happy at our group that is called Ideologies. James mentioned at the beginning. It's at Coletivo. It's not underlined. How to say like the one from Mac at Coletivo _Ideologies. I will write over there on the chat. We are on Instagram, and just send us a message and we will connect you with several different groups that are trying to organize it. Another good way to stay connected in Brazil is to go to the local councils that support public health. So every municipality has one, and they are very engaged in discussing and how each local place it's facing COVID-19. So it's very important. Anyone could participate around the meeting. Okay.
So if I may, on behalf of the panelists, thank Heather and Omar, New York University Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies, and Defend Democracy in Brazil, and NACLA, as wonderful institutions and people who are doing amazing things. We want to thank you very much for organizing this event and inviting us to participate.
Yes, thank you, Jimmy, Maria Mendonça, Michael Fox, Luisa, for being our panelists and for all our great partners. Also ask you to visit defenddemocracyinbrazil.org or our pages on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Again, defenddemocracyinbrazil.org. And you can email us as well at media@defenddemocracyinbrazil.org to connect on how to get into any sort of resistance movement in the US as well. And we are partners and members of the USNDB, so we work together.
Thanks to everyone who participated, who attended, and good night.
Boa noite, a luta continua.
Boa noite.
Boa noite. Good night.